Well, something happened to me this week that has created quite a bit of worry and anxiety in my life. And what took place is I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine, a good friend of mine, and we were talking about this year, 2020, and we were just kind of going back and forth and sharing, how can we make this year a better year than last year? And so he was sharing with me, he was like, here's my top 3 things, and here's what I want to see accomplished and all this kind of stuff, and it was great, and we talked about that. But then he looked at me and he said, hey, Buck, how about you? Like, how's 2020 going to be a better year than last year for you? And so as we were talking about that, I talked about several things, but I said, the number one thing this year that I would really love to see happen is to get healthy. Because I said, I'm getting older. One of the greatest gifts I can give Jill is my health. One of the greatest gifts I can give my boys is my health. To give you guys is my health, that the best version of me. And so we were talking about that, and then he looks at me and he says this. He goes, Buck, are you serious? Like, are you really serious about this? I said, yeah. I mean, this is really important. And he goes, okay, if you're really serious about this, then I have a bet for you. And he kind of baited me into it, and I was like, man, that's cool, I'm in. And I go, what's the bet? And he goes, the bet is this. He goes, by March 22nd, if you don't lose 20 pounds, then I get to shave your head. And I was like, I've had this since middle school. I mean, this is my style, right? And so, that moment that you're like, maybe I shouldn't have given him what, I want to get better at, And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, I'm kind of a risky guy. So I reached across the table and I shook his hand and I said, you're on. But then I thought to myself, well, I have tried to lose 20 pounds for over 20 years and I failed every time. I haven't been able to accomplish it. So as you can imagine, I have a lot of worry and anxiety inside of me right now. So now the reason I share that with you, or the reason why I started that way, is because today we're in part 3 of this series called Better, where we're talking about how can 2020 be a better year than last year? How can we get to the end of this year and honestly just say, man, this was a great year. In fact, it was a better year. And I think, if the research is correct, which I'll share that with you in just a second, but if the research is correct, then guys, I think we've got to talk about this. Because when it comes to worry, when it comes to stress, when it comes to anxiety, I think, from the smallest things of life, from, hey, did I feed my kids this morning? Do they have everything they need for school? All those kind of like small things to the biggest things of life. I think every single one of us, certainly to varying degrees, this year in 2020, will have worry, we'll have stress, we'll have anxiety. And if we're going to have a better year than last year, we've got to begin to understand it. And we've got to begin to start looking at worry. Again, especially if the research is correct. Because according to the latest research, the latest Gallup survey that they recently did, where they looked at 140 countries, and the whole goal of the survey was to say, what countries are the most stressed countries? Out of 140 countries, did you know that the United States is right at the top? In fact, here's the 4 most stressed out, worrisome kind of countries: Greece, Philippines, Tanzania, and look at us, the United States of America. And guys, when I read this survey, it was fascinating to me because I'm thinking to myself, we have more freedom and more prosperity in this country, and yet we're at the very top of the list when it comes to what countries around the world worry the very most. And then, in addition to that, the American Psychiatric Association just provided some latest research, and here's what they said. Look at this. This is hard to believe. Almost 40% of Americans are more anxious than they were at this time last year. So take a snapshot of last year, and this year, we're more anxious. Now, I don't know if that's because of the, elections coming up. I don't know if that's because of finances. Maybe you have a little bit more, and you're going, hey, now that I have more, I'm thinking about, am I going to lose it? Am I going to lose it? I mean, I don't know what that's about, but that's fascinating to think about. 40% of us are more stressed out than we were last year. And then, something I learned a couple months ago that just shocked me and really kind of breaks my heart is from a gentleman by the name of Tim Elmore. I had a chance to talk with him, and he's a researcher, sociologist, and he's written a lot of great leadership books, and he just published a brand new book. And in this brand new book, he was talking about what generations are most stressed out. Like, we're stressed as a nation, but like what generation, what people are most stressed in our country? And his conclusion, according to his research, is the number one generation in our country that deals with stress the very most is Gen Z. Gen Z are 8-year-olds all the way to a 24-year-old. Guys, that's my kids. That's my sons. And if you have kids, odds are that's the ages of your kids as well. That they're dealing with anxiety more than any other generation. And do you know who's number 2? It's their parents. It's Gen X, approximately, late 30s to mid to late 50s. That's number 2. And so guys, if we're ever going to sit down and go, hey, have an honest conversation about 2020 being a better year than 2019, then I think honestly, every single one of us would say, yeah, we've got to talk about this. When it comes to worry, when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to stress, and how it just can hold us back, how it can shackle us, how it can keep us from having a better year than last year, yeah, we got to talk about it. We got to begin to look at it and begin to understand what it's all about. And so that's what we're going to do today. And to do that, what I want to do is I actually want to share an ancient story with you. And this is a story that actually took place about 3,000 years ago is the story we're going to look at. And 3,000 years ago, we're going to look at one particular individual. And this individual was so full of stress and so full of anxiety that he actually wanted to die. Like that, he was like, it's too much. I just want to go and die because the stress is overwhelming. I mean, he had a lot of it. And in the midst of his anxiety, in the midst of his stress, God asked him a phenomenal question, such a pointed and helpful question that we're going to discover today. So, this story again takes place about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. And 1,000 years before Jesus is here, the nation of Israel had basically had 3 kings. The first king of the nation of Israel was King Saul, and then followed by King David, and then followed by King David's son, King Solomon. And under the rule and leadership of King Solomon, the nation of Israel actually was divided. And it was divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom was referenced to as Israel, and the southern kingdom of Israel was, or the southern kingdom of the nation of Israel was referenced to as Judah. And that may explain some of the, tensions or questions you have when you read the Old Testament. Sometimes you're like, I thought it was just Israel, and now we're talking about Judah, and we're talking about, what is this? It feels like there's 2 kings. You would be absolutely correct because the nation was divided. And today we're going to look at the story specifically with the northern kingdom and the king of the northern kingdom, which would be Israel. And the king of the northern kingdom, his name was King Ahab. And if you know about this ancient story or you know about King Ahab, you know this guy was one bad dude. In fact, he was as bad as you could possibly imagine. In fact, the scriptures describe him this way. Imagine if this was the description of our lives. They say, the scriptures say, King Ahab, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. I mean, I just think, well, if that was a description of me, Buck did more evil than anyone before him. Wow, that's one bad dude. And what King Ahab he predominantly did is he basically just turned his back on the God of Israel. And he began to worship the god Baal and the gods of Asherah. And he began to lead the nation of Israel away from the God and the king, or the God of Israel. And one of the ways he did that, or one of his partners in crime, if you will, was his wife. And his wife's name was Jezebel. And let me just tell you, if you know Jezebel's story, it is not a great story. In fact, you could think of Jezebel as the wicked witch of the northern kingdom. She was as bad as you can imagine. And Jezebel had one goal, honestly. Her number one goal was to lead the nation of Israel, to move the people of Israel, to stop worshiping the God of Israel and begin worshiping the gods Baal and Asherah. And they went so far to begin to tear down all the altars to the God of Israel, all the religious kind of places to the God of Israel, and to build new altars and new religious sites to the gods Baal and Asherah. And this went on for year after year after year, and the nation of Israel is being misled and deceived. And finally, it kind of begins to fill the nostrils of God. And he has enough. And so God decides to send King Ahab a voice, very much like God sends a voice in our lives when we get off the tracks. When we get off the tracks in our marriage, or we get off the tracks morally, or we get off the tracks, in one area of our life, sometimes, God sends that voice. Maybe it's the voice of your mom, the voice of your dad. Maybe it's the voice of that small group leader. Maybe it's the voice of that mentor in your life. So God sends a voice to King Ahab, and the voice he sent was a prophet by the name of Elijah. And in the Old Testament, this is how God spoke. God spoke through the prophets. In fact, prophets are often referred to as the mouthpiece of God in the Old Testament. So Elijah comes to King Ahab. And Elijah basically says, hey, King Ahab, God has had enough. The God of Israel has had enough. And here's what he's going to do to get your attention and the attention of the people of Israel. He's going to turn off the economy. And the way you turn off the economy in that kind of agrarian culture is he's going to stop the rain. No more rain. And the economy will shut off. Well, King Ahab heard this and he's like, are you kidding me? I mean, the God of it, he's no God. It's Baal and Asherah. And he just dismissed Elijah, said to Elijah, just get out of here, get out of here. Well, Elijah left. A day passes, a week passes, a month passes, no rain. A year passes, no rain. 3 years pass, no rain. The economy is in shambles. And then Elijah shows up to King Ahab and says, I told you so. I told you so. And he says, King Ahab, here's the deal. God's going to turn the rain back on. But before he turns the rain back on, we need to do something. And what we need to do is we kind of need to have a little bit of a showdown. And what I mean by that is I want you to take all 400 priests to Baal and Asherah, and I want you to meet me on Mount Carmel. Now, what's really cool, you can go here today. You can see where this story takes place. This is just a beautiful, kind of majestic place. And so he says to King Ahab, I want you to meet me right here, and I want you to bring all your priests, and I'll meet you guys up there. And we're going to pray to our gods, and whatever God causes it to rain is the one true God. And so they set the date, they set the time, and now word begins to spread throughout the nation of Israel. And now thousands and thousands and now tens of thousands of Israelites meet right here for, if you will, the Super Bowl of gods. Like, who's the one true God? And the day and the time finally comes. And there's the 400 priests. And there's King Ahab. And there's Elijah. And Elijah says to King Ahab, you guys go first. So all these priests, they get all their activities in the altars and sacrifices, and they all start, praying and worshiping Baal and say, Baal, please make it rain. And they're just going on and carrying on. And in the meantime, I mean, this is happening for hours and hours. They're worshiping and calling on, Baal to make it rain. In the meantime, Elijah's over here, and he's rebuilding the altar to the God of Israel. Because remember, Jezebel had them all torn down. And so one stone after the other, and from morning till just past lunch, he's rebuilding and watching all the activities. And all these priests start getting a little bit crazy. And they start cutting themselves. They start getting nuts as much as they can to beg the God of Baal, please make it rain. And then what Elijah does next is just one of the things I love about the Bible. Because Elijah, he's a prophet of God. Keep this in mind. A prophet of God. After lunch, they've been at this for hours and hours and hours, goes to King Ahab, goes to the priest, of Baal, and he goes, guys, what's going on? And he begins to mock him. And he says this, he says, hey, what's up with Baal? Is Baal on vacation? Is Baal sleeping? Is Baal going to the bathroom? Is he, caught in the bathroom? He just begins to mock him. And you're reading this, and I'm like, wow, this is a prophet of God, and he's this sarcastic? Unbelievable. And so he does this, and then finally he goes, okay, let's get serious. He goes, okay, King Ahab, priest, my turn. He goes over to the altar, and he says, here's what I want you to do. Can you pour all these massive buckets of water, think about 55-gallon drums of water, can you pour that on this altar? And that was a big thing because remember, it hadn't rained for 3 years. It was a precious thing, water was, but they agreed to it. They poured these huge things of water all over the altar. And Elijah said, the reason I want you to do this is because I want you to know there's no funny business. Like, this is the real deal. Who's the one true God? And so it's absolutely drenched. Everybody's watching. All around the mountain, everyone's there. And Elijah prays. And God sets the altar ablaze. And it rips the heart of the people of Israel because they know they've been misled for years. And they know they've turned their backs on the one true God of Israel. And so the people of Israel, and you know, what happens next is pretty gory. They decide, hey, we're going to slaughter those 400 priests because they had so misled us for these years. So they slaughter the priest. And then after that's done, guess what happens? Rain falls. Well, King Ahab, I mean, he sees all this. And I mean, he's so embarrassed. He's so angry. He kind of tucks his tail, you know, between his legs, and he goes home to his palace. And guess who he goes home to? Jezebel. And the way the context of the passage, and just as, you know, I look at this passage, I think King Ahab was a little bit of a passive man, you know, kind of a whiny man, like, hey, Jezebel, you lead, I'm just going to sit in the background, that kind of thing. And when he comes home, here's what he says to Jezebel. Here's how the story continues. Now, Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. And I just imagine kind of in a whiny voice, he's saying, you know, hey, he killed all the prophets with a sword. It's just terrible. There's nothing I could have done. And Jezebel says, step back, O king, because I'm the real leader here. And here's what we're going to do. And Jezebel's plan was to send a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them, of one of those prophets, or one of those priests that you slaughtered. So the messenger goes to Elijah, says, Elijah, here's the deal. Jezebel's going to kill you tomorrow, just like those priests. And the question becomes, so what did Elijah do? You know, what did he do in this moment? And we would speculate, just from the context of the story, we would speculate and say, well, I bet you Elijah said, come on, bring it on, honey. Jezebel, bring what you got. Did you just see what God did at Mount Carmel? Did you just see that? You know, that's what we're thinking. But you know what happens? We know. Here's what happened. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And here we get a glimpse into what worry is all about, what anxiety is all about. Because Elijah was fine in the current now, but he was freaking out about the future nows. That Elijah was fine in the current, right where he was at, but the threat of tomorrow, the unknown of tomorrow, I can't control tomorrow, had him all worked up on the inside. And guys, that's what anxiety and worry is all about. It's about we cannot control the outcome of tomorrow. As much as we may try, we can't control it. It's about the threat of tomorrow. It's about the unknown of tomorrow. And as a result of the unknown of tomorrow, we worry about our kids. I mean, what if she or what if he, what if they make this kind of choice? What if they don't get into the school church? What if they hang out with it? And we feel that. And we have this anxiety and we worry about our kids because of the threat of tomorrow. We worry about our careers. Am I going to get that job? Am I not going to get that job? Is the company going to make it? I feel so much stress. I mean, what's going to happen tomorrow? We worry about our marriage. Am I going to be lonely my whole life? Are we going to make this work out? Is this going to work out? Are we going to make it tomorrow? You know, we worry about our finances. Am I going to have enough? Am I going to have enough? I don't know. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen tomorrow? That worry is all about the future and the unknown aspects of tomorrow. And when we worry, do you know what else happens? When we worry, we become obsessed with what's going to happen and forget much of what has happened. In other words, when we're kind of myopically focused on, you know, what's going to happen, and that's kind of front and center and driving our anxiety and worry and stress, what's going to happen, we forget about God's past faithfulness. And if you're here today and you're not a Jesus follower, I think the majority of us, those of you watching online, those of us here, I think the majority of us would say, yeah, there's got to be something. There's got to be a God. And oftentimes when we're so focused on the tomorrow and our worry, we lose sight of God's past faithfulness in our lives. And guys, I'm so guilty of this. Man, I'm with you today. I'm talking to me as well as you. And you know an area that I lose sight of God's past faithfulness? And this happens several times a year. You know an area this happens for me? It happens right here. Because, you know, Sunday mornings I get done talking, and then I go home and I pass out for a little bit. And then I wake up Monday morning. And when I come into the office, do you know what I look at? I look at a blank piece of paper with this cursor just blinking and blinking and blinking. And I think to myself some weeks, what am I going to say? I mean, how am I going to, you know, what do I need? You know, I have an idea, but how am I going to write that? How's that going to be engaging? How's that going to be helpful? how do I like phrase this? How do I illustrate this? No, that's not going to work. And I start feeling all of that. And I'm like, I got 6 days, 6 days. Here it comes, another final exam. All this kind of, and I start, throughout the week, I start feeling all that pressure and all that stress. And then I go home and guess what I dream about? You know what I dream about sometimes? I dream about standing right here in front of every single one of you. And I have nothing to say. And all you guys are looking at me, you're like, hey, talk, big boy, come on, say something helpful. Something that makes a little bit of sense. And I'm like, I got nothing. I'm just all locked up. And you're all looking at me. And I'm all stressed out. And that is one of my worries. And in the midst of that, when those weeks are happening, you know what I lose sight of? Is the fact that for 10 years, God has been so faithful, week after week after week, to fill that page. Now, there are some weeks I get in the way and I mess it all up and it's not coherent or whatever, but God has been so faithful in my past, and I lose sight of that. You know where else I do when it comes to work and just kind of North Point stuff? Every Easter and Christmas Eve, same kind of thing happens. Like there's so much work that goes behind the scenes. There's so many different, services, and we're anticipating like this is what it's going to be and trend lines and all this kind of stuff. And so we're thinking about all that. And then the week leading up to Christmas Eve or the week leading up to Easter, a thought in my head that it just keeps going over and over and over. I'm thinking, no one's going to come. No one's going to show up. We're just going to all get here with all this work and nothing's going to happen. And it's crazy because it's like I've lost sight of a decade that year after year, every year, we see record numbers on Easter and Christmas Eve. And that God is incredibly, incredibly faithful. Perhaps in your life, when you worry, when you're stressed, when that thing, whatever that is, that's robbing you of today because you're thinking so much about the future, it keeps you from seeing his faithfulness in your life as well. Well, this is going on with Elijah. And so Elijah, he's so stressed out. He's lost sight of what God has done and how faithful God has been. And so where does he run? Well, we know where Elijah runs. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So for 40 days and 40 nights, he runs 300 miles away from where he is. And for those 40 days and 40 nights, you know where God was? God was right there with him. God was providing nourishment. God was providing, for his thirst. God was right there with Elijah. But Elijah didn't even notice that. Elijah didn't even take that into consideration because he was so focused on his anxieties and his worries. And I'm just telling you, oftentimes, in the midst of our worry, in the midst of our anxiety, God's right there with you. He's so faithful in the present. But we simply cannot see it because we're so consumed about what's going to happen. What's going to happen? So Elijah is consumed and he runs. He runs 300 miles away to Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Horeb is an interesting place because it's synonymous with Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is a really big place because that's the place where Moses went and saw the burning bush, if you're familiar with the Old Testament stories. That's the place that Moses went as he led the nation of Israel out of captivity or out of slavery from the Egyptians. They went to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up to the top of the mountain. The cloud, covers kind of the cloud of God. And God gives him the 10 commandments. Moses comes down to the people and said, here's the big 10. That's Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, one and the same. And the perception was that's where God would hang out. And Elijah was going to die. He had convinced himself it's too much. There's too much stress. And so I'm going to be close to God at Mount Horeb for my life to end because he was overwhelmed by his worry. So he's overwhelmed. And what happens? And here's where God asked him a question. And I think this is a phenomenal question. He's in the cave 300 miles away from where he should be. And the word of the Lord came to him. And God said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah, what are you doing here? You're 300 miles away from where I've called you to be. Elijah, what's going on? What are you doing here? And I love this question, because I think it's so experientially relevant and true to every single one of our lives. Because isn't it true that when worry begins to creep up and anxieties begin to creep up and stress begins to creep up, that our temptation is to run? just to run like Elijah? You know, I know it is for me. And you know one of the places I run, one of the places I go to is right here. I run to my head. Because I can be physically present with Jill and the boys, and I can be there, but I am not emotionally or mentally present. And they can be talking, and you know, little Jonathan or, you know, Big Sam, they're all, you know, here's my day, and here's what's going on, and here's what I'm stressed about and everything. Or Jill's like, hey, you know, how was this? And the whole time I'm in my head, I'm just hearing blah, 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 blah. I don't hear anything. And I'm like, because I'm so consumed with what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. Where do you run, honestly? When you feel that just start boiling up and your back muscles get tight and your neck gets all, you know, and that stress and anxiety, where do you run? Do you run perhaps like I do, and you're there physically but emotionally and mentally you're not there? And those that you love the very most just stay on the outside and perhaps begin to be confused because they're like, why isn't he present? Why isn't she present? Perhaps do you run to not one drink, but 2 drinks, 3 drinks, 4 drinks? You run to numb. You've got to numb it and numb it. So you run perhaps to a habit. You run perhaps to an addiction because you just want to numb this. Do you run spiritually? Like, God, if it's not going to go good, if one thing goes bad or these 3 things go bad in my life, you must not love me, so I'm just going to run from God? Do you run spiritually? Or do you run physically? You know, and maybe relationally. In fact, several years ago, I heard a story of a very, very famous preacher who's on TV, the whole thing, great, great guy. But behind the scenes, there was something happening. And behind the scenes, every Saturday night, his wife would pick a fight with him. Then she would leave and run to numb and not come back for 2 days. And the reason why is because she was so overwhelmed because the pressures of Sunday, the microscope of putting on their family, putting on their marriage, putting on their kids, and she felt that and felt all the stress and anxiety of the microscope. And every Saturday night, she would pick a fight. And this guy, I mean, lots of people know him in the church world every night or every Saturday. And then she would leave and she would go run to numb. And people in the church, they were like, I wonder where his wife is. I guess she's in the choir. Maybe she's in the choir somewhere over there. They just didn't know. Do you run? Maybe physically? Do you run perhaps from relationship to relationship? See, Elijah was running 300 miles away from where he should be. And God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Well, Elijah decides to answer the question. And it's fascinating what he says because he responds to God and he's like, God, I'm telling you what I'm doing here in this cave to die. I am overwhelmed. And it is too much. It's too overwhelming. It's too difficult. He says, I'm all alone. No one gets it. I'm the only one who gets it and gets who you are. Everybody's abandoned you. It's just too much. And if you had to describe Elijah's response to God to the question, what are you doing here? You could describe it in one word, two. Now, this word has some history with me. In fact, the first time I kind of bumped into some tension with this word too was when I was working at Dell. And when I was working at Dell, you know, I had several accounts and I had account managers or account executives and they would go and visit and the whole thing. And so we'd work as a team. Well, one particular account manager or one particular account executive, we were working together on this account. And this account was so difficult. Like we were trying to sell products and get lines of business and all this kind of stuff and all these incentives and all these different approaches, but nothing was working. And then on one particular day, I'm having lunch with this account executive, and we're talking about our account set. And we're talking about this one account. And I started ranting. I was like, you know, it's just too hard. And, man, we're trying everything. It's too difficult. It's just too. And as I'm ranting, right in the middle of my rant and right in the middle of lunch, this account executive begins to go, And I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, Buck, this is the world's smallest violin for all of your little twos. Because then we don't have to do anything. Now, I would suggest not doing this in your marriage. Probably is going to create some stress, right? Don't do that there. But that was the first time I was confronted with this idea to go, yeah, if I say two, then really I'm just off the hook. But the time this really became personal to me, and you know, this idea of two became very like, man, I've got to think about using this word, is with my counselor. Because when I would meet with my counselor, I would say, hey, here's what's going on in my marriage. It's so hard. Here's what's going on. Personal struggle. Here's what's so hard. Here's what's going on with my boys. And I'm describing it. And I'm like, it feels so overwhelming. And it's too difficult. It's too hard. It's too much. And my counselor would pause me. and just say, Buck, I know. I know that's what you feel. I know that's where you're at, and I get it. But can we outlaw this word too? Because as soon as you say to, you're off the hook. As soon as you say to, you don't have to do anything. As soon as you say to, you just can stay in the cave, in your worry and in your anxiety. Can we just not use that word? And guys, that's been so incredibly helpful for me because there is something we can do. And so Elijah, he's like, God, it's too hard, it's too difficult, it's too. And God says, okay, Elijah, maybe I need to remind you of something. And here's what happens next. I love this in the story. The Lord said, okay, Elijah, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, which, by the way, Elijah didn't. He just stood back in the cave. He didn't even do this. But God continued, and God did what he was going to do anyways. For the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And then it continues. After the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Now, this phrase, the Lord was not in, means this wasn't holistically God, the fire, the earthquake, or the wind. It's just an aspect. It's a little fraction of what God's capable of. God was just showing off to Elijah and saying, Elijah, don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I can do? Don't you know that I am the God of tomorrow, next week, next month, your future? Don't you know I'm for you? Don't you know what I can do? And God does all of this. And then I love how this passage wraps up and God's approach to Elijah. After all of this power and mightiness, God came to Elijah with a gentle whisper. Very relational. And he asked him the question again. Elijah, what are you doing here? Kiddo, you know better than this. Don't you know who I am? Elijah, if there is no me, if there is no God, please worry. By all means, you should have a lot of stress and anxiety if there's no God. But Elijah, there's me. There's me. Have you lost sight of what I did at Mount Carmel? Have you lost sight that for those 40 days I was right there with you? Have you lost sight of the fire and the earthquake and the wind and my power and what I'm capable of? Have you lost sight that even in the midst of you running from me, that I will approach you with a gentle whisper? I know what you're going through. I haven't changed. I'm 100% for you. Elijah, what are you doing here? What a phenomenal question. And guys, here's the deal. If 2020 is going to be a better year than 2019, then I think we've got to get really honest with our worries and our anxieties and our stress. And I want you to think about this, and this is for you. This is for your benefit. I want you to at least consider a couple of these questions just for you. Think about this. Have you allowed your worries to drive you to run to places you shouldn't go? Like, honestly, whatever that thing is, think about whatever that worry is. Is it driving you to places you shouldn't go? Is it driving you from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 drinks a night because you're running to numb? Is it driving you to a habit? Is it driving you to an addiction? Is it driving you to run relationally or to be numb when you're in front of your kids or in front of your wife or husband because you're there physically, but you're not there emotionally and you're not there mentally? Where's that worry causing you to run? And with wherever you run, wherever you're at, I think God's question for you and God's question for me in the midst of our worry is, kiddo, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Have you lost sight of who I am and how much I am for you? I think another question we've got to consider in the midst of our worries is, have you let today's worries erase God's past faithfulness? And if so, I'm just telling you, one of the most practical things you can do from this message, one of the most practical things you can do this afternoon and this next week, and I would strongly encourage you to do it, is just go through your photo albums. And if you've got like physical photos or digital photos, however you store your photos, I would just go through them. And as you go through those albums, I would just have your computer or a piece of paper, and I want you to write down all the times God has been faithful in your life. And as you look at your son being born, oh God, that you're so faithful. As your daughter, you're so faithful. As you look at that first job and the pictures of it, that first house, that first car, as you look at how God carries you through that health crisis, or how God reconciled your marriage, or how God walked alongside of you with your son or daughter through those prodigal years, and he was right there with you, and you just didn't see it because you were so consumed about their future. Man, just write that down, one after another, and put God's faithfulness and the things you wrote down in a safe place. And then from this day forward, anytime God does something amazing in your life, anytime you get that promotion, anytime God is so faithful with your kids, anytime God is faithful with your mom or dad or in that health crisis, I just want you to write it down and keep it in a safe place, because here's what I know for you and for me, is that worry blocks out, anxiety clouds out God's past faithfulness. And one of the greatest things we can do in the midst of our anxiety and worries is just go back and realize what God has done and how faithful he is. So, let me just ask one last question. What are you worried about? Like, as you think about your life, what is the thing that you would just say, honestly, that's the thing that's driving my anxiety. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. That's the thing that keeps my back muscles so tight. That's the thing that drives me to run to places I have no business being. What is that for you? And with whatever that is, what I want to do with our last couple minutes is I want you to perhaps take your eyes off that thing and put your eyes on something different. And to help with that, I want us to hear a song, and it's a song that's very special to me. It's a song called "It Is Well With My Soul." And the reason why this song is so special is because this was my mom's favorite song. And my mom, as she was battling cancer and all the unknowns, which cancer ultimately took her life, as she was battling that, I remember there were so many phone calls and so many times I sat next to her bed that she would talk to me about her worries and anxieties. And am I going to see my grandchildren grow up? Am I going to see my son grow up? Am I going to see my daughter? What's going to happen in the future? Am I going to suffer in ways I never want to suffer? Is that going to happen? And she would get full of anxiety, rightly so. And then what she would do over and over and over is she would play this song. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And this song reminded her to take her eyes off her worries and put them on the one who's been so incredibly faithful. And it reminded her of God's faithfulness in her life. And it allowed her to honestly, legitimately say, in the midst of whatever's going on, it is well with my soul. So what is that thing that you're worried about, that's stressing you out? And with whatever that is, would you just take a few minutes and just think about how faithful God has been?
Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well. It is well. So let it go, my soul, and trust in him. The waves and wind still know his name. So let it go, my soul, and trust in him. The waves and winds
So what is that for you? What's that thing? It's keeping you up at night. It's robbing you of being present. It's driving you to places you have no business being. What is that? And with whatever that is, would you be willing to do what you can do today? In other words, this is not about being irresponsible. Like, do what you can do today, be faithful. But then would you trust God with the outcomes of tomorrow? If we're willing to do that, it's one of the things that really positions us to have a better year in 2020 than in 2019. And that's what I so desire for every single one of us. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much that we can just come before you and pause throughout the week and be reminded of some things that may be really important to remind ourselves. That you are for us, that you love us, that you are faithful. And Father, today I just know the worry and anxiety and stress can be very different for all of us and at different stages and levels. But God, you know that. And so would you please meet us today and this week? And would you help us take our eyes off whatever that may be and put our eyes on you? Because you are the God of the past, you are the God of the present, and you are the God of the future. Help us hold on to that. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.